Hi, good morning everyone. Welcome to week 1 of Science 7. I am so happy to have you on board. My name is Saira Abdurrahim and I am your science teacher. For today's video, we are going to talk about scientific investigation. But before that, let me present to you our objectives for today's topic. So at the end of the class discussion, you are expected to be able to first discuss the different steps of scientific method. Next, discuss the components of a scientific investigation. And lastly, break down the components of a scientific investigation.
And you are also expected to perform the following activities at the end of our lesson. So first activity, playing the murder mystery game activity. Next, applying the components of a scientific investigation in a concept map activity. And then lastly, identify real-life problems and implement real-life situation using the steps of a scientific method.
But before we start, let me ask you a question first. What comes in your mind when you hear or see the word scientific investigation? What words can you think that can be connected to a scientific investigation? Can you also think of a situation that involves scientific investigation? Okay, so I have here an example of a situation. A team of science students is carrying out a scientific investigation to determine the physicochemical and bacteriological quality of water samples collected around the community. So now, do you have ideas already about today's topic? Okay, yes, we are going to talk about scientific skills, scientist process to conduct a research, and anything that'll involve problem-solving situations. Now, if you are going to solve a problem, can you immediately solve it? Or do you follow some steps to determine what is the problem and how will you solve it? Okay, so class, pag moingon gali ta og scientific investigation, apil na dira ang solving problem, mga scientific skills, mga situation nga ga-involve og kanang mag-investigate bitaw, kanang mga research, hypothesis, apil na siya dira. So karon mag-discuss ta kung unsa-unsa ang mga naa dira para makasolve ta og problem. Unsa jud na ang scientific investigation ug unsa ang mga steps nga ginagamit sa scientist para mag-investigate sa mga problem, situational problem rather. So class, did you know that scientists has a systematic and orderly approach to gathering data and solving problems? What do you think is this approach? So scientists follows a systematic approach to gather data, or should I say accurate data, in their research. So this systematic approach is called the scientific method. Now what is scientific method? The scientific method involves a series of steps that are used to investigate a natural occurrence. So how can you use the scientific method in your life? Again, how can you use the scientific method in your life? Now, for us to be able to answer this question, of course, we must first understand kung ano-ano nga ba yung mga steps na involved doon sa tinatawag na scientific method. Paano to ginagamit ng mga scientists at ano ang connection nito sa scientific investigation. Okay, so now let's proceed to the steps of the scientific method. So first step, we have here the problem or the question. So of course, the first thing you do when you are doing a scientific investigation is to analyze the problem. Ano nga ba yung isosolve mo? Ano ba yung problema? So you must develop a question or a problem that can be solved through experimentation. Okay, so when you already knew the problem to your investigation or to your research, of course we proceed now to the observation or the research. Okay, so step 2, observation or research. Make observations and research your topic of interest. So pag alam mo na yung problema mo, gagawa ka na ngayon ng aksyon, magre-research ka na. So you can go to the library and read up on information related to the problem that you identified. You can also review existing records or data. Or you can also consult experts who have worked on a similar problem. If your problem affects a particular community, okay, so pag community na daw ang involved, you can interview officials or authorities who have jurisdiction over the area. Doing research is a valuable tool in making smart decisions. If you are equipped with some basic information, you can decide on what components or variables to manipulate or adjust. Okay, so let's have a recap. Kanina yung first step na diniscuss natin is identifying the problem. Now, once you identify the problem, we proceed to the next step, which is research the problem or research information related to your problem. Now, after you do that, we proceed to the step 3, which is to formulate a hypothesis. Okay, so to formulate a hypothesis, you will predict a possible answer to the problem or question. Again, predict a possible answer to the problem or question. Example, if soil temperatures rise, then plant growth will increase. Okay, so now once you have the hypothesis, we will proceed to the fourth step, which is the experiment. In experiment, you will develop and follow a procedure. So, this include a detailed materials list and the outcome must be measurable. Okay, so design your experiment and write the step-by-step procedure that you will use to test your hypothesis. Okay, now you will gather the materials that you will need. Identify the treatment that you will implement so that you can compare the results with the reference data. Observe and record what happens when one variable is manipulated or changed. Okay, so once you're done designing your experiment, you will now collect and analyze results. Modify the procedure if needed. Confirm the results by retesting, and these steps include tables, graphs, and photographs. So, ang sabi dito, pag nakagawa ka na ng experiment, of course, after that, i-analyze mo na yon. Organize your data into tables and graphs so that it will be easier to visualize the results. You will then summarize the data presented in your charts and tables. What trends do you observe?
Okay, so now, after you collect and analyze the result, you will then conclude. If the conclusion supports the hypothesis, then accept your hypothesis and recommend other components to further investigation. So conclusion is a statement that accepts or rejects the hypothesis. Make recommendations for further study and possible improvements to the procedure. You can share the difficulties you encountered in the course of your study, what you will do differently, and how. If the conclusion refutes the hypothesis, then reject that hypothesis. Accept its counter hypothesis, then recommend other ways of solving your problem.
Then we proceed to the last step, which is to communicate the results. Present or publish. So when you publish your work, expect questions and criticisms from the readers and the audiences. So again, what are the steps in scientific method? Okay, yes. First, we are going to identify a problem or develop question. Okay, so what's next? Okay, next, you observe your topic of interest or research the information related to the problem. Then third step, you formulate a hypothesis. And then the fourth step, design an experiment. And then the fifth step, collect and analyze results after you design the experiment. And then after that, conclusion. Okay, so last, communicate the result. Okay. Now let's proceed to our next slide. Let's put our knowledge of the scientific method to a realistic example that includes some of the terms you'll be needing to use and understand. Okay, so the next slide will be a situational example on how to apply this scientific method. Okay, so now let's start with the first step, the problem or the question. Okay, so the situation here, John watches his grandmother bake bread. He asks his grandmother what makes the bread rise. She explains that yeast releases the gas as it feeds on sugar. John wonders if the amount of sugar used in the recipe will affect the size of the bread loaf. So kanina napag-usapan na natin na ang first step sa scientific method is to identify the problem or to develop a question. Now, what is the question here dito sa situation na to? Okay, very good. The question here is if the amount of sugar used in the recipe will affect the size of the bread loaf. Okay, so now we proceed to the second step, which is the observation or the research. So, di ba nakapag-develop na si John ng question kanina. Now, he proceeds to the research or the observation. Okay, the situation here is John researches the areas to baking and fermentation and tries to come up with a way to test his question. He keeps all of his information on this topic in a journal. Now, after John did his research or gathered data and information about the problem he is investigating, he then formulates a hypothesis. Okay, after talking with his teacher and conducting further research, he comes up with a hypothesis. Okay, his hypothesis is if more sugar is added, then the bread will rise higher. So let's now discuss hypothesis. So when you say hypothesis, it is an educated guess about the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. These variables will be defined in the next few slides.
Okay, class. So the first variable we are going to discuss is the independent variable. So from the word itself, independent, it means it can be manipulated. So the independent variable or the manipulated variable is a factor that's intentionally varied by the experimenter. So kapag ikaw ang nag-i-experiment or gumagawa ng experiment, ang tanong lagi, what factors do you want to change or manipulate? Anong mga factors doon sa experiment mo ang gusto mong baguhin? Ang gusto mong iba-ibahin or galawin? Okay, so in this situation, John is going to use 25 gram, 50 gram, 100 gram, 250 gram, and 500 gram of sugar in his experiment. So ano yung independent variable ni John? Yes, very good. The amount of sugar in his experiment. Okay, so now let's proceed to the other variable. Kasi the other variable here is called the dependent variable. Kung yung independent variable kayang i-manipulate, itong dependent variable naman ang nagre-respond doon sa manipulated variable. Okay, so the dependent or responding variable is the factor that may change as a result of changes made in the independent variable. So again, kung ikaw yung experimenter, ang tanong naman dito, what factors do you want to observe or measure? Again, what factors do you want to observe or measure? So the answer will be the dependent variable. This is the result of the change in the independent variable. So for example, in this case, it would be the size of the loaf of bread. Again, for the case of John, it would be the size of the loaf of bread. Okay, so now let's proceed to the control group. In a scientific experiment, the control is the group that serves as the standard of comparison. The control group may be a no treatment or an experimenter selected group. So this is the variable in the experiment that is constant or remain the same. The control group is exposed to the same conditions as the experimental group, except for the variable being tested. Note that all experiments should have a control group. Okay, so in a scientist experiment, the use of a control is an important aspect. A control isolates the effect of one variable while holding all other variables the same for all. So, we will find out in the next slide kung ano yung control group na ginamit ni John. Because his grandmother always used 50 grams of sugar in her recipe, John is going to use that amount in his control group. So again, what did John use in his control group? The 50-gram amount of sugar. Very good. Okay, so now let's proceed to the term constants. All other factors stay the same so that any observed changes in the bread can be attributed to the variation in the amount of sugar. So again, constant meaning stay the same or hindi nagbabago. Okay, so for John's case, the factors that he will keep constant or the same are the other ingredients to the bread recipe. So what are those? Okay, so they might include oven used, the rise time, the brand of ingredients, the cooking time, type of pan used, the air temperature and humidity, where the bread was rising, the oven temperature, and the age of the yeast. Now let's proceed to the fourth step, which is the experiment. Okay, John writes out his procedure for his experiment along with the materials list in his journal. He has both of these checked by his teacher, where she checks for any safety concerns. Okay, so when you do an experiment, kailangan may hawak ka laging journal or yung record book mo para maitala mo kung ano yung mga pagbabago or kung ano yung mga ginawa mong changes or add-ups doon sa experiment mo. So, you will be guided. Okay, so under experiment, we have this term trials. So, when we say trials, it refers to replicate groups that are exposed to the same conditions in an experiment. Okay, so John Yu is going to test each sugar variable 3 times. Now, for our fifth step, we will going to discuss the collect and analyze results. After experiment, you will then collect and analyze results. Okay, so for John's case, John comes up with a table he can use to record his data. John gets all his materials together and carries out his experiment. Okay, so how will you collect and analyze results? Of course, you will have to record your data for you to analyze after. Okay, so for this step, this is the part where John organized his data into tables or graphs so that it will be easier for him to visualize the results he gathered. Then after that, he will then ask himself, what trends did he observe? So John examines his data and notices that his control worked the best in this experiment, but not significantly better than 100 grams of sugar. So what will he do next? He then rejects his hypothesis but decides to retest or to do a retest using sugar amounts between 50 gram and 100 gram of sugar. So what are the numbers between 50 and 100? Okay, very good. 60, 70, 80, and 90. So after conducting a retest, John finally came up with another conclusion. He found out that 70 grams of sugar produces the largest loaf. So the conclusion is the conclusion supports his hypothesis this time. So his hypothesis is accepted. You have any question? Okay, so if none, then let's have a quick review. Okay, so for our first question, what is a scientific method? Again, what is a scientific method? So, a scientific method is a systematic way of generating information based on keen observation. So for our next question, what are the 7 steps of scientific method? Again, what are the 7 steps of scientific method? So if you answered problem or question, observation or research, formulate hypothesis, experiment, collect and analyze result, conclusion, and finally communicate the result, then you are right. So for our third question, what was the experimental group? Okay class, so this question is based on our situational example that we had a while ago. Okay, so this is based on John's case. What was the experimental group in John's case? Okay, so if you answered that the experimental group are the different amount of sugar, which are 25 gram, 100 gram, 250 gram, and 500 gram, then you are correct. Now for our fourth question, what was the control group? Okay, so this time we are asking for the control group. What was the control group in John's case? Very good. The control group is the 50 gram of sugar. Now how about the independent variable? What is or what are the independent variable in John's case? Now class, the independent variable, again it is the manipulated variable. So the answer here is very good, the amount of sugar. Now let's proceed to the dependent variable. What is or what are the dependent variable in John's case? So if the independent variable is the manipulated variable, And yung manipulated variable natin kanina is yung amount ng sugar. Ano naman yung dependent variable? So the answer here, the size of the loaf bread. Now, what factor did John keep constant? What did he keep constant or yung hindi niya binago sa experiment niya? The answer is, okay, so the answer is the other ingredients to the bread recipe and the oven use, the rise time, the brand of ingredients, the cooking time, the type of pan used, the air temperature and humidity where the bread was rising, the oven temperature and the age of the yeast. So now let's proceed to our main topic, which is the scientific investigation. So what do you think is a scientific investigation? Okay, so scientific investigation is a quest to find the answer to a question using the scientific method. In turn, the scientific method is a systematic process that involves using measurable observations to formulate, test, or modify a hypothesis. Finally, a hypothesis is a proposed explanation for some observed phenomenon based on experience or research. Scientific investigation is what people like you and me use to develop better models and explanations for the world around them. Okay, so scientific investigation is divided into two components. So the first component is what you call the science process skills. Okay, then the next component is the so-called manipulative skills. So the following are the steps involved in scientific investigation. So this is just the same as the scientific method. Let's proceed. We are almost at the end of our discussion. Now we are going to discuss about the scientific skills. This is the last part of our discussion. So we are going to talk about the two components of scientific investigation. So let's start with the first component, the science process skills. When we say science process skills, this is the use of time and space relationship. This includes interpreting data, defined operationally, controlling variables, making hypotheses, and experimenting. So, the following are the steps involved in science process skills. So, we have here observing, classifying, measuring and using numbers, making inferences, predicting, and then lastly, communicating. Now let's move on to the other component, which is the manipulative skills. When we say manipulative skills, this is the use of our body parts, which is our hands. So this includes using and handling science apparatus, maintaining science apparatus correctly and safely, cleaning science apparatus correctly, handling specimen correctly and carefully, and then lastly, sketch specimen and science apparatus. So that's it for our week 1 discussion. I hope everybody understands the lesson, but if you still have any other question, please don't hesitate to contact me at my cell phone number, which is flash on screen. And by the way, for your activities, please visit our Gaitif e-learning site, which you may find at https://www.gaitif.com/elearning. So that's it. My name is Saira Abdurrahim. I am your science teacher. Thank you and have a good day.